In the 1950s, America had broken free from the shackles of wartime economics. It was walking with the swagger of a nation that had the world by the tail. Scientists had harnessed nuclear energy. Jet-propelled airplanes were breaking speed records, and the race to space was on. But perhaps more than anything else, one thing melded imagination and consumerism, putting this era in perfect context. The concept car. Unlike satellites, rockets, and jet planes, these dream cars were accessible. People flocked to auto shows to see concept cars in their titanium-bodied glory. They were snapshots of how America perceived its future. They were simply out of sight, unforgettable. But what happened to them? Most were destroyed. Some just plain vanished. But amazingly, some are still here. In the 1940s, the world was at war. To win it required industrial might, daring experiments, and a very special new vehicle.
The Jeep could do everything a horse could do except eat hay.
But it also has a dark secret.
I mean, this is wartime and anything goes.
By the 1950s, America was ready to have some fun.
It is the 1955 Flageolet 4Runner.
A car that lets you dream about the future.
I've played around with cars all my life. This is one of the very cool ones.
In the spring of 1940, Hitler's armies smashed across the borders of the Netherlands and Belgium and raced into the northern reaches of France. Great Britain was in trouble. The bombing of London had just begun, and it was clear that without outside assistance, all of Western Europe would soon be overrun. America had not yet officially entered the war, but that appeared inevitable. In its preparations, the U.S. Army discovered it had one glaring weakness. It needed a new car.
The War Department sent out an RFP, a request for proposals, to 134 car makers. And the War Department said, we want a new vehicle that will replace the horse. It has to go any place a horse can go. It has to climb a 30-degree grade. It has to be able to pull a gun. And you know what? It can't weigh any more than a big horse, 2,000 pounds max.
The demands were extreme, and the timeline was absurd.
Now, the War Department had said, we want this miracle vehicle. We want it in 49 days, a prototype delivered to Camp Holabird, Maryland. Well, the big guys said, oh, it can't be done. A miracle car in 49 days? Get serious.
Luckily for the free world, there was one tiny company that dared to take on the challenge. The American Bantam Car Company from Butler, Pennsylvania.
Bantam was about to go out of business anyway. They had been building midget cars on the British Austin pattern for a number of years, but in America, everyone wanted big American cars, not midget runabouts. So the guys at Bantam said, I think we can do this. Let's open up those factory doors. Let's wamp up this car, deliver it in 49 days. And they did it.
They did it by tearing down and reconstructing the Bantam Speedster. It was a cute little two-seater that wasn't selling very well. It was made fun of in editorial cartoons and dismissed as a mere toy by the automotive establishment. If you look closely, there's no doubt about the two cars' relationship. Some parts, such as the dashboard, look as though all they did was slap on a coat of green paint. Less than 2 months to create the prototype, there was no time to get clever about accessories. They were on a shoestring budget and took any chance they had to use existing parts. They called it the Bantam Reconnaissance Car.
They drove the thing from Butler to Camp Hullabard, Maryland. It's about 400 miles because they didn't have a trailer to haul it, and they had to break in the engine anyway. They delivered it. An Army Ordnance Major looked the thing up and down and said, "Okay, we'll give it a try."
The Army didn't have much choice. Bantam was the only car maker to show up with a prototype.
They started by dropping the thing off the loading dock, vertical drops. Well, it didn't break, so we'll give it a test. They ran it through mud bogs. They hauled logs behind it with chains. They jumped it over dirt berms. By the end of a week of testing, the thing was a bucket of bolts. That ordnance major went to the engineers at Bantam, looked them in the eye and said, "Boy, you know that little car you sent us? Well, it's exactly what we're talking about. We need 300,000 of these things. When can you deliver?"
It should have been the greatest day in the company's history. This could have been the story of how hard work and clever ingenuity by a handful of dedicated men saved a company from ruin. But instead, those words by the Army Major were a death sentence.
Well, the guys at Bantam had never built more than 500 units in a year's time in the history of their company. And now they had this huge government contract. It looked like Bantam was going to be king of the automotive world with a big government contract. But the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, America found itself in a shooting war, and Bantam couldn't keep up with the production demands.
Bantam built about 300 cars before the Army got impatient.
The War Department actually let Ford and Willis Overland inspect Bantam's Jeep. They gave them the blueprints and said, "Can you do better?" I mean, this is wartime and anything goes. So Bantam really didn't have a chance competing with the big guys. The War Department let contracts to Willis Overland that made over 300,000 Jeeps, and then they couldn't keep up with the demand, so Ford made another 280,000. But little Bantam, they quit after about 300. In fact, all they really got out of the deal was the contract for making those two-wheel trailers that track behind a Jeep. You know, that distinctive looking Jeep trailer? After the war, they really kind of lost their horsepower, and by the mid-1950s, they were out of business.
What did survive is this car, BRC number 7, known lovingly as Gramps.
This car that we have is actually serial number 7. It's the oldest Jeep on planet Earth. There's no Jeep vehicle older than this one. It was donated by the War Department in 1944 to the Smithsonian Institution, and the Smithsonian has it on loan to the Heinz History Center here in Pittsburgh. But think about that for a minute. 1944, D-Day is going on. The war is still in doubt, and the War Department says, you know, this little car that we've got, this Jeep, has revolutionized the way we fight wars. It's an important piece. Let's send it to the Smithsonian. Gives you a sense of the confidence of a nation in being able to win the war, but also their sense of history, that this little Jeep was an innovation that made history.
General Dwight Eisenhower agreed. He went as far to say that the Jeep was one of 3 inventions, along with the cargo plane known as Dakota, and amphibious landing craft that allowed the Allies to win the war.
The Jeep was the essence of a utility vehicle. There were no frills on it, no extra weight. It could pull a gun. It had 63 horsepower. It could haul men. And if you've ever seen pictures of Jeeps in battle or films from World War II, you'll see that they lashed all kinds of gear on it, sea rations, people piled on it. It was unstoppable in the mud, in the snow, on grades. It could go anywhere.
After the war, the Jeep returned home to a hero's welcome.
Think about this for a minute. All those young soldiers who went off to war, 18, 19, 20 years old, the Jeep was the first car they ever drove. So there was a love affair with the Jeep that extended well beyond the war years.
Despite being one of the most famous brands in American automotive history, the one thing no one can agree on is where the name came from.
Some historians say the name goes back as early as World War I, when they started naming oddball vehicles Peeps and Jeeps. Some historians think it's derived from general purpose, GP vehicle. Some say it's from Eugene the Jeep, the Popeye comic character, kind of an alien with magical powers. Well, this little army vehicle had magical powers. Why not call it a Jeep?
One, two, three.
Your favourite hard-working vets are back.
Job well done.
It's amazing.
Bondi Vet, the new series, Monday, only on Animal Planet and Animal Planet HD.
The story of the 4Runner, a car built in 1955 but designed for 1970, actually starts back in 1930. It was the early days of the Great Depression. Bill Flajoll was a teenager living in rural Michigan. Like lots of young boys, he liked to draw cars.
At the age of 15, he submitted a series of sketches to Chrysler Corporation in part of a contest. Walter P. Chrysler was so enamored by his drawings that he offered him a job. And when he graduated high school in 1933, he left for Detroit with 20 bucks in his pocket and jumped on a bus and started his career with Chrysler.
His namesake, the Flajoll 4Runner, was still more than 20 years away, but his talent was already on display.
He ended up working for Ford and General Motors, and 6 years later, he opened up his own design firm and started designing cars for the Big Three.
Bill's company really started to shine in the post-war years.
It was really a booming time. You know, the demographics were changing. People were moving out of the city, moving out into the suburbs. You know, it was realized that, people were becoming a two-car family.
Two-car families meant female drivers were hitting the road in record numbers. That created a demand for smaller cars. Bill Flajoll's answer to that demand was the Metropolitan.
So he created this Metropolitan and shopped it around to the Big Three, and it really didn't go anywhere until he had a chance meeting with somebody from Nash Kelvinator and ended up meeting with George Mason, who was the CEO of Nash, and thus the Nash Metropolitan was born. It was one of those iconic cars. It's one of those cars that you look like a Volkswagen Beetle or something like that, and you think, oh, that's so cute, I just gotta have it. Well, it was thinking outside the box, but it really served a good purpose.
It also established Bill Flajoll as a star in the world of automotive design. With the Nash Metropolitan on his resume, Bill was free to do what he always wanted: design a car for the future.
It's this wild futuristic thing. I mean, it looks wild today. I can't imagine when Bill rolled it out of his garage in 1955 what people thought of this thing. I mean, it's got the great scallops and the wheel arches. It's got that crazy plexiglass roof that slides back into the body, the hidden headlights. You know, it's just really, I mean, you would have never seen anything like that before, obviously, because it's the only one.
Bill's futuristic roadster had half a dozen groundbreaking features. Some have become industry staples, while others proved to be mistakes best not repeated. The Flageoles 4Runner, as the name suggests, is a forward-looking concept car. In 1955, Bill Flageoles used the fame and fortune he had earned by designing the Nash Metropolitan to create a vehicle with the audacity of predicting the future. But while Bill thought he was reaching ahead 15 years, some of his concepts took less than 15 months to catch on.
The white scoops, I mean, that's just a great design trend that sort of emulates that era.
The oversized scoops around the tires were painted white for aesthetic reasons, but they also had a practical side. Their shape collected air and directed it in to cool the brakes.
You look at the earlier Corvettes, you look at some of the General Motors concept cars, a lot of those cars had that.
The 4Runner's plexiglass retractable roof was not quite as successful. Throughout the 50s, designers tried different ways of using a bubble canopy, but in the end, there was no way to prevent the interior of the car from becoming a greenhouse and roasting the occupants.
It's not very practical. I mean, it's pretty much a goldfish bowl. And luckily that one's tinted, but I can imagine cooking across Las Vegas desert in the summertime, you would be roasting in no time.
The see-through roof does serve one very important feature. Since there is no back window in the 4Runner, the rear-view mirror is mounted on top of the windshield frame, a feature that without a transparent top would be impossible.
The only other car I've seen that on is one of the early Lamborghini Countach Periscopos, that the roof is so small there actually was a little mirror built into the roof panel that you could look through to see backwards. Not that you could see backwards in those cars anyways.
Two of the car's simplest innovations have proved to be the most enduring: the seats and the headlights.
Well, the headlights behind the grille was somewhat of a new idea. You know, the cars were being more streamlined, and this was a way just to not have to work around a headlight. If you could hide them some way, and of course a lot of cars have pop-up headlights later on in the days. So that was really a style forward thinking.
The two front seats, the only two seats, were called airline style. We know them today as bucket seats, something that is now standard on virtually every vehicle on the road.
It really fits those cars. I couldn't imagine what that would look like with a bench seat, but it's very futuristic, you know, even with the leather and stuff like that.
The 4Runner made the cover of Motor Trend magazine in September 1955, and its distinctive look made it wildly popular. There were also some modern materials in use.
People were just starting to experiment with fiberglass cars. Perhaps you heard something, some strange car like a Corvette. You know, maybe people might have heard about that. But yeah, so it was that era of creating really cool bodies out of a really easy to work with material called fiberglass.
Bill used his car to look into the future, but we can use it to look into the past.
Well, you know, this car says a lot about 1955 and the post-war era. You know, America was back on boom. You know, families were able to start buying things again and enjoy life. They were, you know, driving their cars more. People were falling in love. You know, the jet age was starting to come out. Tail fins were coming about. And it was just that whole great innocent era where nothing is going to go wrong. You know, the Cold War is out there, but we're not too worried about it. And we're going to live life to the large. This car really says that. This car never went into production because it was one man's dream. It was just something that was not for the masses. You know, General Motors had a hard time selling Corvettes, and Ford was selling Thunderbirds, but there was no way this car could have competed. This was his own creation for his own personal use. You know, he kept this car until 1972, and he was using it as his daily driver. So it was really just, you know, his personal passion to say, put his stamp on it and say, this is mine, it's my car, I built it.
His creation now sits here at the Antique Auto Museum in Hershey, Pennsylvania, a symbol of what people in the past thought the future would be like. Bill's career as a designer spanned almost 50 years, from the Great Depression through the war years and into the booming 50s and the turbulent 60s.
Bill was much more than a car designer. You know, like a lot of other designers of that day, he became an industrial designer and, you know, designed yachts and washing machines and clocks and gadgets and everything like that. He was a Renaissance man. He played around to the end of his life, you know, living life large and being happy, doing what he loves to do.
Through it all, his first love was always the automobile, specifically a tiny purple car with big dreams.
In our collection of 200 cars here, I played around with a lot of them, and I've played around with cars all my life. This is one of the very cool ones. I mean, you don't have another one like this.